So now we're going to talk about probably one of the most important cases in American history. This really changes everything in America. It's a big turning point, and it absolutely has positive consequences, but also creates a lot of conflict. We're going to talk about Oliver Brown versus the Board of Education, Topeka, Kansas, 1954. So I'm sure you guys have probably heard something about this story about Linda Brown. She was a third grader who was an African American girl. She lived across the street from a white school in Topeka, Kansas. It wasn't even in the South, which is interesting. However, she had to walk several blocks, maybe close to a mile or so, to get to a black school, which was further away. And her father, Oliver Brown, so remember, minors wouldn't be filing the cases, would be the adults, believed that his daughter should be able to go to an integrated school, the white school right across the street, and that regardless of her skin color, you couldn't separate, that's not fair. Well, the truth behind the case is that, first of all, Brown versus Board of Education is not just one case. It was actually a collaboration of lawyers and cases that was put together by the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, strongest African American organization we've talked about in America. And what they do, and the guy in the bottom left-hand corner is an amazing attorney and judge. His name is Thurgood Marshall. Now, Thurgood Marshall is actually the first African American Supreme Court justice in America, and that's him with his gown on. And he argued successfully with a team of attorneys that separate was inherently unequal. Now, this is what's called judicial activism, which is to go against precedents and to change policy in America, this ruling. Because up until 1954, in 1896, you had Homer Plessy versus Ferguson. And if you guys remember, early in the year, we talked about how Homer Plessy had sued the Ferguson Train Company because he was being discriminated against because he was like 1/30th or like 1/16th African American. And they asked him to go to a back train car in Louisiana. And he said, fine, I'll go. But then he used legality to sue and fight. And what happened in the end is it actually worked against him. And the Supreme Court at the time ruled that, yes, you can separate train cars as long as the train cars are equal, like they're equal in the way they're created. And only one judge at the time actually voted against it and said that you could do this, you could apply it to anyone for anything. And they did. They did. In the South especially, they start putting segregation or what are called Jim Crow laws all the way up until 1954, and this is the beginning of the end, Brown versus Board. Because Earl Warren, who believes in judicial activism in this case, interesting guy. He was actually governor of California. Wasn't necessarily completely the regular judge as you'd think of. It was actually chosen by Eisenhower, Dwight D. Eisenhower, President Eisenhower, a Republican, to be the Supreme Court justice, and he became the chief justice of the court. And he really swayed the court on this. And he told all nine judges, we have to be together on this. We have to change the policy, and there's no such thing as separate but equal. As soon as you separate people, it's unequal. That's why you say, like, public schools, if you have an all-boy, all-girls school, that's separating, that one school is going to be is probably going to be different or better or worse than the other school just by taking children apart or based on race, skin color, sex, gender, whatever in the public sphere. So this case changes everything. It opens the door. Here's the problem, though. While this is an example of de jure segregation or legal segregation being ended, it is not an example of de facto segregation or segregation by people themselves. Just because you integrate the schools, force public school integration legally, doesn't mean that people are necessarily going to move into different neighborhoods and white and black people are going to live together in a diverse, amazing world. And we can see that still today. And we can look at the data on that. So let's look at the data. Have things changed? Well, I think that you could it's a fair assumption to make that segregation in education is probably the number one way to increase your wealth, right? The average person increases their wealth through education. If you get more educated, you get more professional, or you you get more skilled in some kind of trade, you're going to start making more income. If you're less educated, then your labor is less valuable because there's less demand. So let's look at this. Asian families make about $67,000 per family, per person, I'm sorry, while a white or Hispanic, or household, I'm sorry, Hispanic white people make about $58,000 for their medium household income. And the average is 51, almost 52. But this is what's really scary is Hispanics are only making like $42,000 a year now. And African Americans are even below that. The average African American household is only hanging on maybe $35,000. These are huge discrepancies in the amount of money the average person makes based on race. It shouldn't look like that. It should be about the same, or at least within a small range. It isn't. And what's really scary is if you look at the green areas you see when recessions are, that's when you start to see sometimes even more discrepancies. Like subgroups do even much better in a recession. And this is really scary. If you look at like African Americans, you could just see that they would dip even more in Latinx or Hispanics in certain recession periods. All right, this is insane. You look at unemployment rates since 1972. This is always blowing my mind. So the average for unemployment, for example, let's pick a year. For Americans is the blue line, okay? So in 2000, when things are really good, unemployment was like 4%, right? About 2000, 1999. You go with African Americans, they were still at about 8%. They were double. And look at how parallel it really is. This is crazy. Think about this. In 1981, the average unemployment was 9% of Americans were unemployed in 1981. Things were bad. African Americans were almost at 20% unemployment. It means 1 out of 5 African Americans did not have a job. And again, unemployment only covers you've been trying to get a job in the last year. That's it. That's the trick to unemployment. They only count people who have been looking for a job for the past year. So if you would look at real unemployment, which means everybody that's unemployed that wants a job, I think you're going to see a much bigger discrepancy with African Americans than to the average because they're discriminated against as well. So those gaps are probably going to get even bigger. There's probably a lot of African Americans that are sitting there, don't have a job. They have not been counted in the 1 year conclusion. Now, here's some other consequences. So have things gotten better? I don't know. Incarceration rates. We talk about racial bias and targeting certain groups. This is insane. Out of 100,000 people, so this is proportional. If you have 100,000 white people, 380 are incarcerated or are in prison. Latinx or Latino, almost 966. That's almost 1%. Almost 1 out of 100 Latinx people are in jail currently, right now. African Americans, and this is mind-boggling, out of 100,000 African Americans, over 2,200 out of 100,000 are in jail. That's insane. That's 2.2%. So over 2 people are in jail out of 100 in African Americans. And then you have to think about the long-term consequences when they get out of jail. How hard is it to move from there? Now you've been incarcerated. You have to put that on every job application. And there's a lot of jobs, the companies that won't. They're just going to throw out your application if you've been fired. They don't want to hear the story or why you're incarcerated. They don't care. You could have been innocent. It doesn't matter. So African Americans and Latinx are put at a huge disproportional disadvantage right then and there. Now, this is interesting. This is education. So education, Brown versus Board. Has that made a lot of changes? Well, let's look. So if you say that discrimination stopped in 1954, I would argue that we've never been truly integrated, still today. I don't think that America is integrated. I think that you guys can go to Normandy High School right now. You probably won't see any white students, and I think you could go to Lindbergh High School and you probably see a handful of African American or Latinx students in the whole building. That's the de facto. It's not that the schools are doing it anymore, but it's de facto. People still live in segregated neighborhoods. Chicago is the most segregated city in the United States, according to the data. But let's look at this. So Brown versus Board should have at least helped, right? And maybe it has. But look at the growth on this. This is insane. 30% of white people have a BA, have graduated college or higher. African Americans, you're talking about 14%. That's insane. That's over twice as many white people go to college and graduate. or go higher in their life than African Americans. They're twice as likely if you're white. Hispanics is even less than that. You're looking at maybe 14%, something like that, or 13%, even lower. Then we looked at the household incomes. We said, well, whites, the average household income is almost getting around 60,000. African Americans are high 30s. Latinx barely over $40,000 a year. That's insane. And the data's a little bit older, so that's gone up some. Percentage of owned houses. This is big. We talked about redlining and social steering. This is the data. This is the truth. And then you could draw your conclusions based on this, but almost 3 out of 4 white Americans own a house. Less than half of African Americans own a house. Hispanics is less than that, maybe 45%. Now, when I say own a house or own a townhouse or a condo, I mean they just own something. It doesn't say the value of the house. That's a whole nother ballgame we'll talk about. But we're just talking about owning a house. So you think about how many people actually own houses, and you have houses in neighborhoods where the houses are maybe $10,000-$20,000 a piece, and then you have houses that are in neighborhoods where the houses are $1 million a piece, right? But overall, less than half of people of color own houses. White people, almost 3 out of 4. That's a huge discrepancy. Now, this is most segregated states for black students, 2011. Percentage of black students in majority white schools. So this is interesting. Some of the most segregated states for black students are, you look at the percentages, they're pretty low. Are pretty high are California, Nevada, Texas, Mississippi, and Louisiana. I don't think you're surprised by that. Illinois, I think some people would be shocked at. You think of California as pretty progressive, or New York. So it's not necessarily always what I think people think of like, oh, Alabama or like a southern state. There's a lot of discrimination, de facto discrimination, where people live based on race. And also housing. Remember, they can price people out. You don't have to put what's called racial covenants that we've talked about. If you make houses so expensive, and we know African Americans only make $34,000 a year compared to $60,000 a year, they're not going to be able to live in that neighborhood, or most African Americans won't be able to. So that's a way of maintaining discrimination. Let's look at this. Shifts in segregation in 1964. This actually is so eye-opening and scary to me. So there's Plessy versus Ferguson. Okay? There's no shift. Schools are segregated or they're integrated. It's starting to get a little, I mean, we're talking like a slither better in like 6 years, in the 60s. 64, now we're starting to move in the right direction. Now you've got Central Park 5, you've got examples of people are trying to integrate. It's getting better. And this is good. This is positive. Here's the growth. 70s going up. 70s, it stops all of a sudden. 76, it starts dropping in the 80s. Pops up really good, 86, 88, and then it just stops. And then from there, it's down, 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 down. And now we're down to 23% of schools shift and say are not segregated. That's scary. And I think if you look at this trend, I think it's continuing to get more segregated. And you're going to have to take huge institutional shifts like housing. African Americans, people of color, are going to be able to buy houses. Their jobs themselves are going to have to make more income. But I obviously, as a teacher, I'm going to argue schools are super important. The fact that we have completely unequal schools. You can go to some schools where they have like brand new smart boards and every kid has a brand new laptop. And you go to other schools where they don't have enough computers for students, and students have access to Wi-Fi outside of the school. That's a problem. And that's not always just racial. It could be regional. In rural Missouri, there are places where kids can't afford internet and they don't have that access. So they're not getting the same opportunities as students that live in West County, which is one of the wealthiest places in Missouri. Now, we talked about the Jim Crow, and the Jim Crow de jure segregation that's what Brown versus Board beat. And we've talked about this before, the black codes. Separate but equal laws, Jim Crow laws, okay? And then we talk about this in class. And then we're going to look at de facto segregation we talked about, but that's racial, ethnic, other segregation resulting from societal differences. So groups are choosing to live de facto. The schools aren't getting less integrated because of the government has reversed the policy in some places. The president, Reagan, did put in some executive orders that made it easier to segregate. But we've also stopped a lot of these systems that helped integrate, like busing systems where you move kids from the city into the county and vice versa. A lot of that stuff has become unpopular. And then we can see here's a picture of the Central Park 9, if you've heard of this. And in 1957, this is how insane it was to get students to go. These African American students are going to go to Central High. They have a little museum there now. They literally had to send in the military. They have the military protecting the students to go to school. People are throwing stuff at them, spitting at them. When they were in the school, the kids would talk about how they get pushed down the stairs, they get hit with their trays at lunchtime. A lot of what happened in the building in some shape and form was worse than trying to get into the building.